Well, good morning to all of you, to my congregation. I am grateful that you tune in and listen. I pray that what I have to say helps you and keeps you edified and strong. Again, I'm sorry that we have to do things this way, but until this passes, then we'll love our brothers and sisters, we'll love our neighbors here in America and try to help stop the spread of this virus. Today, when you're viewing this tomorrow on Sunday, it's a special day for a lot of people in the world, and that's okay. I thought I'd have something along those lines as well. I always try to do something a little bit different, but we'll see what happens. I want you, if you don't mind, let's bow in prayer. Father, thank you for each day that you give us to serve, and help us to remember that the Lord's Day is the day that reminds us of Jesus' sacrifice and shedding of blood, but his victory. And today, help us, Father, to realize that that gives us strength and power and confidence to walk every day in your light. And it's through Jesus that we pray. Amen. Back somewhere around 1997, there were two fellows named Christopher and Daniel who went to Harvard University, and they became very famous in psychological circles because of an experiment that they did. What they did was they created a video, and there were 6 people in this video, men and women combined. Three of them were wearing white shirts, and 3 of them wearing black shirts. And each team had a basketball. And when the video would start, you would see the white team passing the ball to each other, bouncing it or throwing it in the air, and the black team doing the very same thing. Plus, they would be moving around in kind of a tight circle. It looked random. Nobody on the team really looked all that trained with the basketball, but still, they did pretty good. What these two, what Christopher and Daniel did was they had test subjects who would come in and view this video. And at the beginning of the video, before it got started, one of them would say, "Now we want you to count the number of basketball passes that the white team, that is those who are in the white shirt, do." And so then all of a sudden, you see this video, and they're passing the ball, both teams, randomly back and forth. So you really have to focus upon, upon the team with the white shirts on, and count. At the end, whoever was on the video said, "Now, if you counted 15 passes, that was the correct number." And I have another question for you. Did you see the gorilla? Now, what's interesting about this is that about halfway through the video of watching and counting them, this individual dressed in a gorilla suit comes very slowly walking into the middle of these 2 teams, turns and faces the camera and does the little gorilla thing, and then raises its hands, and then turns and walks slowly out. Now, looking at that, I think, how can anybody miss that? But yet, half of their subjects missed the gorilla when they watched it. Now, to further this, and to show that that we're all suspect to this, they did a further video where they had the same thing, two teams, 3 each, wearing white shirts and black shirts, passing a basketball to each other. And the video starts off by saying, count the number of passes. And in the middle of them doing this gorilla walks in, turns, and does the same thing and walks out. And again, while I'm watching this second one, they say, "Well, did you see the gorilla?" Which I said, "Yeah, I already know about this." I said, "However, did you notice that there were 2 other things that changed during the video?" And I completely missed these, even though I was kind of focused on the video. The curtain in the back changed from red to orange, or maybe it was orange to red. And one of the persons on the team wearing the black shirts walked off before the gorilla came on. So I missed that. So you see, we can get so focused upon details that we miss other things that come about. And I really believe that that's what happened in Jesus' day. The leaders and most of Israel were so focused upon their idea of what the Messiah was going to be about that they completely missed who Jesus was, the real Messiah, when he came. But I want to show you, though, that in spite of that fact, that we, while we look back and say, oh, well, look at, they missed Jesus and Messiah, then you know that there's another aspect of Jesus I think that sometimes we miss too. And the Gospel of Mark helps us to see that this other aspect of Jesus is just as important. And even though it's his cross, I think we'll see that sometimes we miss that as well. But anyway, in Mark chapter 8, there's Peter's confession. Mark chapter 8, verse 27. Jesus went out along with his disciples to the village of Caesarea Philippi, and on the way he questioned his disciples, said, who do people say that I am? And they told him John the Baptist, and others say Elijah, and still others the prophet. So even those who weren't the leaders, they still missed who Jesus was. They were trying to identify him as some great individual in the past. And he says, but who do you say I am? And Peter answered for the group and said, you are the Christ. Now, of course, Mark's is a little bit shorter than Matthew's account in this. But still, the idea is that the disciples got who Jesus was. He's the Christ, the Messiah. He's the one fulfilling all those Old Testament promises and shadows and types and so forth that told the people that a Messiah was coming. And so in the Old Testament, the Messiahs, the anointed ones, they were all sort of a shadow pointing towards the ultimate one who would come, and they had correctly identified him. And in fact, I think that from what I've read, that the Gospel of Mark is all about the first, leading up to Peter's confession, is all about who Jesus is. And Mark records almost all of the miracles that he has before chapter 8 and before Peter's confession. Because you see, miracles are about God using them to identify through these supernatural acts the ones that he sent. Moses with the 10 plagues, so Elijah with calling fire down out from heaven, and so forth. And so it's important for us to see then that miracles help identify. And Peter and the other apostles had correctly identified Jesus as the Messiah because of the miracles that they saw. But once Jesus establishes his identity with them, now he begins to teach them something new. In Mark chapter 8 and verse 27, it says, Mark chapter 8, verse 31, and he began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. So now that they've correctly identified who Jesus is, what Jesus does is begin to teach them, now that you know who I am, I want you to know why I'm here. I'm here to go to Jerusalem and to be crucified, to be killed. But I'm going to rise again. And so along the way, as Jesus now begins to travel down to Jerusalem, he's going to teach them this 2 more times in order to help it sink in on his purpose, even though they're still not going to get it. Now, something that somebody pointed out to me some years ago, in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, basically, basically once Jesus starts his ministry in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, he never goes down to Jerusalem. He always stays in Galilee, or at least that's how Matthew, Mark, and Luke record it. Now, I know in Luke's gospel, at age 12, we see him going down there, but that's before he actually starts his ministry. But once he starts his ministry, he ministers only in Galilee in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And then he heads down to Jerusalem because that's where his mission is going to be complete. But anyway, he's on the way now. And then again in Mark chapter 9, in verse 30, it says, from there they went out and began to go through Galilee, and he did not want anyone to know about it, for he was teaching his disciples and telling them, the Son of Man is to be delivered into the hands of men, and they will kill him. And when he has been killed, he will rise 3 days later. And it says, but they did not understand this statement, and they were afraid to ask him. And I'll explain why they were afraid to ask him in a little bit. But you see, again, Jesus focuses upon this. In this time, he says he's going to be delivered into the hands of men. Now, one more time, he teaches them before they get to Jerusalem. And this is in chapter 10, in verse 32. They were on the road going to Jerusalem, and Jesus was walking ahead of them. And they were amazed, and those that followed were fearful. And again, he took the 12 aside and began to tell them what was going to happen to him, saying, behold, we are going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be delivered to the chief priests and the scribes, and they will condemn him to death, and then hand him over to the Gentiles, and they will mock him and spit on him and scourge him and kill him, and 3 days later he will rise again. So Jesus now has emphasized, once the disciples have correctly identified him as the Christ, the Messiah, that here is my mission. I'm going to Jerusalem. And in doing so, then I'm going to be killed and buried, but 3 days later I'll rise again. So he's emphasizing to them as they're traveling down, here is my mission. Now, why is this important? Well, we'll get to that in a minute. But I want you to notice, though, the response each time Jesus teaches this. When we go back to chapter 8, after Peter's confession, and Jesus then begins to teach it, it says in chapter 8 of Mark, in verse 32, and he was stating the matter plainly, and Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. Now, Mark doesn't really include what Peter said in this. We know elsewhere that Peter said, no, this will never be. But I can kind of imagine Peter saying, Jesus, you're being too negative here. You got to think positive. We're going to come through this okay. But Peter rebuked Jesus. And think of the irony of the disciple rebuking the master here. But you see, Peter didn't get Jesus' mission. He got Jesus as the Messiah, but not his mission. He was still focused upon what he thought Jesus' mission was. And it certainly wasn't to go and to die. Then in chapter 9 of Mark, after it talks about, after Jesus teaches them again, it says in verse 33, they came to Capernaum, and when he was in the house, he began to question them, what were you discussing on the way? But they were silent, for on the way they had discussed with one another which of them was the greatest. So here Jesus is teaching them, and Mark records this right after Jesus has taught them about him going to Jerusalem and being killed. And then here they are discussing about which one of the 12 was the greatest. Can you imagine that? The irony that they are traveling with one who will be the greatest once he gets on that cross and comes forth from the empty tomb. And here they are thinking that one of them is the greatest, or maybe they are as well. And then later on in chapter 10, again, after Jesus teaches that he's going to Jerusalem to be killed and then rise again, in verse 35 of chapter 10, it says that James and John, two sons of Zebedee, came up to Jesus and were saying, Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you. And of course, what they want is they want to sit on the right and left hand of Jesus. You see, James and John decided we're the greatest. And maybe part of the reason for that is because we learn in the Gospel of Mark elsewhere that Jesus nicknames them the sons of thunder, and they probably think that's a good thing. I would imagine when we get to eternity and if we could ask Jesus, what reason did you do this? It might not necessarily be quite as good as James and John think so, but maybe they, of course, figured that out a little bit later on. But so here is Jesus now. They've correctly identified who he is. He's the Messiah. Now Jesus begins to teach him, here's my mission. And what we see now is they don't get it. And what's also interesting is to go back to Mark chapter 9 in verse 32. Again, after that, it said that when he taught them, they did not understand the statement. They were afraid to ask him. Maybe they remembered the rebuke that Peter got from Jesus. And I'm going to share with you Jesus' response each time. Going back to when Peter when Peter rebukes him, it says there that in Mark chapter 8, verse 33, but turning around and seeing his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, Get behind me, Satan, for you are not setting your mind on God's interest, but on man's. So Jesus there suggests that somehow Satan has got into Peter's mind and is blinding Peter to what really is going on. Years ago, back in the 80s, they began to develop this ZM87, which was a portable laser. And what it was designed was to shoot at people, to aim at people so that they would sustain a retinal injury consistent with the exposure to a laser fire, And the purpose of this was to blind them. Now, since then, they've, of course, put this on the Geneva Convention and have banned it and so forth. And they even used it, some countries have used it to illuminate helicopters and so forth. But here, a laser was developed to blind the enemy. They didn't kill him. They just blinded him, because you see, you defeat an enemy by blinding him, by making him not being able to see. And so a soldier then is completely helpless if he can't see, or at least in this particular case. And so they thought this was a great weapon. But you see, that's what Satan wants to do to us. He wants to blind us so that we don't see properly. He wants to blind us so that we don't understand. And that's what Jesus is telling Peter happened with his mission. That even though he saw him correctly as the Messiah, Satan has further blinded him to who he really is. But then notice Jesus' other statements in response to them in chapter 9 of the Gospel of Mark. It says, sitting down, he called the 12 and said to them, if anyone wants to be first, he shall be last of all and servant of all. So here, while the disciples are discussing who is the greatest, after Jesus teaches them about him going to Jerusalem and being killed and then raising again, they're discussing who is the greatest. But Jesus says, if you really want to be the greatest, you have to be last and servant of all. Who wants to be last? You don't get the best stuff. I mean, today, because people are hoarding stuff, you go into the store, you get what's left over. Nobody wants the leftover stuff when you're last, and nobody wants to be servant of everybody else. We want to be on top, but yet Jesus says that's what you do. You become a servant. And then in verse 36 of Mark chapter 9, he says, taking a child, he set him before him, and taking up in arms, he said, whoever receives one child like this in my name receives me, and whoever receives me does not receive him, but him who sent me. Well, a child is not able to get you ahead in this world. And yet Jesus says when you receive a child, that's like receiving me. But you see, we want to know the best people. We want to know those, we want to know somebody. And because we believe that it's not what you know, but who you know. And yet Jesus says, don't go after all the big names, go after children. And then in chapter 10, after James and John wanted to be on his right and left, the two most important spots in any kingdom, the right and left hand of the king, he says in chapter 10 of verse 43, but it shall not be so among you, but whoever wishes to become great among you shall be your servant, and whoever wishes to be first among you shall be slave of all. And then he tells them, for even the Son of Man did not come to be served. I didn't come for you to serve me. I came to do the serving. And then he says, the Son of Man came to give his life as a ransom. Now, to me, when I hear the word ransom, I think of the money paid out to a kidnapper to get that individual, whoever they kidnapped, back. And that's what I think about here. Now, God doesn't pay anything to Satan to get us back, but God does pay a price in order to get us back. He pays a ransom because Satan has kidnapped us away from his family. So Jesus says, when you stop and think about all of this, here's what I want you to know, that I didn't come to be served. And so you shouldn't want to be served by anybody else, but instead should be the servant of all. And you see, that's Jesus' mission, to give his life as a ransom. And Jesus is saying, this is what I want you to do in following me and helping, in living your life. Now, I believe that there's something that happens just before Peter's confession that kind of shows the fact that even though the disciples got Jesus' identity, he's the Messiah, they didn't get his mission. That there's kind of a two-stage process here. And that this demonstrates to us that while we might be blinded to who Jesus is, and thus not get his mission, we still could get who Jesus is, but be blinded to his mission as well. And even though we might understand his mission to dying on the cross, we may not see how it relates to us in our own life. But going back to Mark chapter 8, in verse 22, it says, they came to Bethsaida, and they brought a blind man to Jesus and implored him to touch him. And taking the blind man by the hand, he brought him out of the village, and after spitting on his eyes and laying hands on him, he asked, Do you see anything? And the man looked up and said, I see men, for I see them like trees walking around. Then again he laid hands on his eyes, and he looked intently and was restored, and began to see everything clearly. And he sent him to his home, saying, do not even enter the village. You hear that? He saw everything clearly. There was a two-stage process. The man started to see, and then he saw clearly. And I really believe, leading into Peter's confession, that what the Gospel of Mark is trying to tell us is that we can see Jesus' identity, but we also need to see his mission. So we can have some of our sight, spiritually speaking, restored, but then go on to have our full sight, and that's the mission. But why is this important? Well, it's important because the cross is our way of life. Now, after Jesus hears Peter's confession and then tells them that I must go to Jerusalem and be killed in Mark chapter 8 and verse 31, and then Peter rebukes him and he says, get behind me. He goes in verse 34 of chapter 8, and it says he summoned the crowd with his disciples and said to them, if anyone wishes to come after me, he must deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. You see here, we understand that Jesus came to die for us. He came to die so that our sins might be forgiven. But you see, part of his mission, though, in doing that, is to get us to come and follow him. And we have to follow him in the way of his mission. And so you see, just identifying Jesus as the Messiah is not enough. That's what Peter and the others did. But unfortunately, they didn't see that there was a mission that went with that. A mission that they had missed, a mission that was there in the Old Testament, part of the fulfillment, and Jesus had come to fulfill. But now they have to see that Jesus wants them to come and follow him. They were going to go down to Jerusalem, and Jesus says, if you want to follow me, then you have to deny yourself and pick up your cross and follow me. Now, when they got down to Jerusalem and they were standing there watching Jesus carrying his cross, it might begin to sink into them, although they're not, I don't think quite fully, that this is what Jesus wants. Jesus wants us to follow after him in the same way. He wants us to become a servant. He wants us to give our life. He wants us to understand that we're not here for self. We're here for him and for others. And so the cross is our way of life. We have to travel that very same road. Now, the road we travel as individuals, we have all kinds of thoughts that come into our head. And Jesus is saying now that we have to deny self, and we have to take those thoughts and put them on the cross as we take up our cross daily, so that we now bring them in line with his mission. We have attitudes in us. We have attitudes towards people. The Pharisees, they didn't like Jesus consorting with the sinners, the tax collectors, and so forth. And they had attitudes towards these individuals. But you see, when we see Jesus, who went to the cross, doing such, that means that we need to follow him as well, and we need to reshape our attitudes. Because the one who went to the cross, he had a different attitude towards sinners than we oftentimes do. There are behaviors along the way and temptations that come with those behaviors. We all have different desires. Every one of us desires different things. And Satan will sometimes put not sometimes, he will all the time put temptations out to get us to behave in ways we know are improper. And Jesus says, I want you to deny self, deny what's going on in your life, and I want you to move forward. And I want you to keep your focus upon the mission. And the mission is that we take up our cross after having denied ourselves. And of course, the road we travel, we're part of a local congregation. And that means we live the cross life, or the life of the cross, in our local congregation as well. Jesus shows us the way. How often do I miss his mission being lived out in my own life? Am I willing to say that my focus is to give my life as a ransom? Well, not as a ransom, but to give my life in the way that Jesus did. How often am I willing to take up the cross? Some people think that that's just burdens that we bear. I think that what Jesus is saying is that we need to follow him. Just as he came to serve everybody else, so we need to be a servant in the same kind of way. And so how about you? You know Jesus as the Christ, but do you know him as the crucified and risen? Do you follow his path of the cross? There's a fellow named Bob Edens, real fellow. I researched this. This is not a preacher's story. He was born blind. He graduated from Furman University. He learned Braille, of course. He got married, had a daughter. He even coached a little league baseball team, and he worked as a masseur. Well, somewhere in November of 1980, well, sometime during November of 1980, he underwent surgery for a detached retina and a corneal transplant. And guess what? He can see again. This was back in 1981. Once he got his full vision, he said, "I never dreamed that yellow was so yellow. I don't have the words. I'm amazed by yellow, but red is my favorite color. I just can't believe red." He said the first thing he saw, though, was an eyedropper in the hands of a nurse. Grass is something I had to get used to. I always thought of it as just fuzz. But to see each individual green stalk is amazing. And to see the hair on my arm that grows just like trees and everything else is amazing. And to see birds flying through the air and everything, it's starting a whole new life. It's the most amazing thing in the world to see things you never thought you could see. You see, his life was one of nothing but darkness. I saw the purple and orange recently in the face of a tiger. I could see the individual hairs and the colors in his eyes. I could see the shape of the moon. And I like nothing better than seeing a jet plane flying across the sky, leaving a vapor trail, and of course sunrises and sunsets. I can't wait to get up each day to see what I can see. I am still seeing most of it for the first time. And at night, I look at the stars in the sky and flashing lights, and I'm learning to read and write by sight, like a first grader. Everything is a constant high. You could never know how wonderful everything is. So you see, when we see Jesus as the Christ and the Messiah, and then we see his mission, and we understand that his mission needs to be lived out in our lives, it brings up a whole new world. And every day we should get up and want to take up our cross, denying ourselves, and follow Jesus. Do you see clearly Jesus and his mission? Are you willing to follow Jesus in that mission? Are you willing to be last, to be servant, to be slave? Are you willing to deny self? Are you willing to follow Jesus to the cross? You see, the disciples were so despondent because Jesus allowed himself to be arrested and then tried and convicted and then crucified. But they didn't realize that Jesus had also said, yes, I'm going to be killed, but I'm going to rise again after 3 days. And you see, Jesus rose to walk in newness of life. And a new life awaits you if you are crucified with Jesus. You're raised now in baptism because that's where it connects us with Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection. And then we're raised on the last day. So if you've never taken the mission of Jesus seriously, today is a good day to do so. But for those of us, though, who know him, for those of us who celebrate his cross and his mission, let's make sure that we're living out his cross in our lives. Because Jesus says that if we really believe he is the Christ, we are to deny ourselves, take our cross, and follow him. And my prayer is that you will do exactly that.